My name's Sakai Machache. I am originally from Zimbabwe, born in Harare, but I've grown up in Glasgow, Scotland, and currently live in Dundee. I'm a visual artist, and I've been asked to come and do a talk here at the British Institute East Africa about a project that I'm working on in collaboration with Awar Onyango, who's sitting next to me.
Yeah, I can confirm that I am Awar Onyango and I'm sitting next to you, yes.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about our practices, and I'm going to go first because I feel, might as well get out of the way.
Yeah.
So I studied at Duncan of Dordenston College of Art and Design in Dundee. I got my undergraduate and my master's degree there, and I'm currently enrolled in a year-long residency programme at the same institution. I would describe my practice as multidisciplinary. I work with photography mostly, but I also work across different media, performance. I'm hoping to work in video in the next year or so. The project we're doing is Body of Land, which has been produced by Focus Scotland, and it's supported by the British Council East Africa and British Council Kenya. And so a little bit about my practice. Basically, initially, it grew out of an attempt to gain some control of my disturbed sleep cycle. So I started to record my dreams. I started dream diaries, drawings, research on psychoanalytic theory, looking at Freud, Jung, etc. And I developed a practice based on sort of trying to symbolically represent, not fully illustrate, the issues that I was coming up against, which were things like, I don't know if people have heard of sleep paralysis, but I'm someone who suffers from that. And also, I was really interested in the hypnagogic state, which is the state between sleeping and waking. So, first images I'm going to show you are from my in the moment of visions of half sleep. That's just another, maybe more poetic way of saying the hypnagogic state, which is the state between sleeping and waking. So, visions of half sleep, and also in the moment of waking, were sort of images created in very dark lighting conditions. And yeah, it's much better with the lights off. So you can see here that I was using a white model for the work, and at the time that was understood that the work was related to sleep and dreams. In the next slides you'll see a series called Eigengrau, which Eigengrau is a German word meaning intrinsic light, intrinsic grey light, which is basically the grey sort of what you see when you're in darkness. Basically, when you close your eyes and you're in full darkness, there is one word that actually fully describes it. In English, it's intrinsic light. And as you can see, I used myself in this body of work, and this is where the trouble came in. Using myself as a black woman, my body is basically considered to represent only issues regarding race, and so the work was sort of misinterpreted quite a lot of the time. Basically, when I'm naming my series, I employ a sort of dictionary of terms that are imperfectly linked to the praxis of my internal visual landscape and aspects of my process with collated language from my mother tongue, Shona. So I don't actually speak Shona very well, because I've grown up in Scotland. Same. I've not had that much exposure to the language. I think when I was about 4 years old, I was as fluent as a 4-year-old can be in their mother tongue. So it's in there somewhere. So I try to use it in some ways to sort of represent certain concepts that I'm working with in my work. More images from Eigengrau here. I was interested in the notion of the divided self and the shadow aspect of self as well. So I was trying to sort of bring that out a little bit in the work, but also still looking at the issues that I was having with my dreams. In later work, I started to use Shona words to kind of express certain ideas in my work. So I'll show you the next pieces. Mashavi. So Mashavi is basically a Shona word meaning the plural of Shavi, which means spirit or wandering spirits. These would be the spirits of people who were who died when they were far from home, or were not given the proper burial rites to allow them to come back into the ancestral sort of realm, where they would be able to actually positively influence the lives of their of the people of their group. So a Mashavi basically is kind of mischievous, kind of similar to like the concept of jinn. And so the series was, for me, it was about this idea of a spirit, but also related to the ways that I was finding my practice being misinterpreted, or how I was dealing with my practice at the time. So I'd written a dissertation called Blackness in Contemporary Art, which was posing the question of whether blackness is a hindering factor to the creative process of artists of colour, with the Shavi representing a splitting of the psyche in reference to W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of double consciousness. The books that are on the table, as you can see over on the right, are sort of, they represent the seminal texts on contemporary African art that I was looking at the time while I was doing my dissertation. And in this sort of image, the Shavi is sort of in the background, taunting, sort of playfully taunting my process. So I'm going to skip forward quite dramatically. Well, there is a link, because while I was making Mashavi, I was working with hair a lot in my work. So you can see braided hair around the neck there of the Shavi, and coming off of the side of the outfit that I made for the project. Accompanying Mashavi on my master's degree show was a piece called Braiding Across a Room. Now, this was just basically me consistently for a year braiding across a room in my house. And it's an interesting way to work, but for me, like, doing things like that is sort of how I think through ideas, using braiding as a sort of metaphor for the journeys that African people in the diaspora have taken, and how we've managed to sort of hold on to certain traditions that I feel are very important to us. Like, and hair is something that, especially for black women, is a very integral part of our identity, and also how we relate to each other and our community. So, as you can see in this image of braiding across a room, it was a very long room. It was 10 meters long, and this braid was very thin in comparison to the one that I'm going to talk about now. So I did an exhibition recently for Glasgow International Festival, and I was in a group exhibition with 3 other black women artists, Najma Abukar, Leila Roxanne Hill, and Adibusola Ramsey, from the collective Yon Afro, of which I'm a founding member. The exhibition took place at the Govanhill Baths, which is an old swimming baths located in an ethnically diverse and neglected area of Glasgow. And the braid in these images is red to signify grief. And this is in relation to another project, another series of photography pieces called Musoro, which I'll show you in a little second. This time I was braiding across a pool rather than braiding across a room. And it was 22 metres long this time, and I managed to do it in 2.5 hours, so I feel quite proud of myself. As you can see, I enlisted some help from other women because the braid got heavier and heavier as I added hair to it. And by the time I got to the end, I was finding it hard to even hold it up, never mind continue to braid. The other woman in red is Ada Busola Ramsey, one of the artists from the exhibition. And she was handing me the hair as I was going, and the other women were holding it up. At the end of the braid, I went up the stairs at the side of the pool and secured it to some theatrical weights at the top. So this is an image of how the braid looked in the pool area and how it related to the work from the series Musoro. So a more close-up look at Musoro itself. So Musoro means head in Shona, but there's another more poetic version, which is a conspicuous covering of the head. And this project was basically in relation to grief from losing my father. So, body of land. At the moment, we're sort of still at the very early stages of working on this project, but both myself and Awa are hoping that we get a lot out of this, I suppose, over the course of the next year. I think we're going to be showing the work in January, both at Koana and at, or I'm not sure exactly where, I think it's maybe at Koana, and also at Street Level Photo Works in Glasgow. And Awa will be coming over to Glasgow in September, so that we can work together there on the actual photo series work, whatever we're going to be doing with lens-based stuff. I'm going to finish with just some images of what I've been doing while I've been here. So since I've been in Nairobi, I've been consistently drawing every day, reading, listening to all sorts of different things, very interesting things, and sort of just allowing things to flow and allowing myself to work as free form as possible. And just through conversations with Awa at the moment, we're just kind of building ideas, still in the very early research and development stage, but I'm going to hand over to Awa so she can talk about her practice as well, and maybe we'll have more info on Body of Land.
How do we switch to my presentation, please? Which is on this? Pass me the thingam. Grazie. Is it gonna? Yeah, we're good. Thank you. Okay, so my name is Awor Onyango. I'm Nairobi based. I'm a writer and an artist. I kind of employ a lot of media in my work. My entrance into art, into making art, is sort of through the lens of message over media. So I'm always trying to see what's the best form what I'm trying to express can like take. So I'm not really going to say I'm a photographer or I paint. I kind of do everything based on how best to communicate what it is I'm trying to communicate. So yeah, I'm gonna skip stuff. So I have some stills from video art because I think Body of Land is kind of heading towards a lens-based space. The art object will probably be a lens-based thing. So I figured I would show you my lens-based work that I've done. This is Makeda, which I did for a digital art fair in 2016. I created, the lens-based bit was the goddess that I tried to create called Makeda, who was supposed to be a kind of guardian of the internet, the guardian of our data, well, my data precisely. I was trying to create a space where people can reflect on the internet, because I feel like there's a lot of things that we use that we don't fully understand, but we just use them. Electricity is one of them. The internet is another thing, where you're like, as long as I have access to this thing, then I can do all these things, or I can communicate to other people, but you're never quite sure where your data is or who it's going to. And so for Makeda, I created an installation that had my internet history, but in code form, in tumbled code, so you couldn't like read that. On the 17th of January, she was looking up like Aries, tarot card, whatever's. But you could kind of see that even after, like, I've deleted my Twitter, or even after, I think it was particularly like Kanye and Childish Gambino at the time, I'd retweeted them back in 2012, and at the time they'd deleted their Twitter, but when I was like tumbling my internet history, their tweets that I retweeted showed up. And so even though part of it was like a hilarious space for me to see what it is I was doing in 2012, and for other people to see that, because there was, that's Makeda again, she's beautiful. This was like my tweets or my social media typing themselves out on a wall. And this particular tweet is by like FKA Twigs. So stuff that I'd forgotten had tweeted, or stuff that people who deleted their social media had tweeted and I'd interacted with, showed up, including messages like between my friends and I. So in that space, it was an installation space, so it was like an entire room that had Makeda peeking in and out of the space, and had like my tumbled code, and also had my social media history, or typing itself out on a wall. So that was one project. This is Lambe, which comes from Leon Gontran Damas. He did a poem called Lambe, which starts, "Give me back my black dolls." And at this point, I was trying to figure out what a good African woman is, or where this myth of like the good African woman, this is something that I'm really quite obsessed with at this point, because there always seems to be a disconnect between what's presented as a good African woman and the kind of stories I'd hear like about my grandmother or people who are of that age. So it seems like, for me, it was sort of easier to connect with women who are in their 90s or who are defiant or like did things than to connect with the women around my mom's age who are like, they, like the Catholic Women's Association, and like they stay for the sake of the family, and you know, they make this really huge sacrifices for the sake of other people and never seem to have anything for themselves. So what I did for Lambe was I went into several archives of Kenya. Most of them actually were like by William Kittner, who was, I think, a chemical engineer who in his 40s decided to go around the world and take footage of like natives in their natural environment, which, okay, let's not unpack that. But he came to Kenya a number of times in, I think, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And I was going through his footage illegally because the University of, I think, Pennsylvania would not let me have it. And I was picking up these women that he was attempting to have, like, to take footage of. And the whole video is kind of a mix of footage that I took of dolls, because every country in Africa that I've been to has these dolls at the market. And I think it's always interesting to see, like, maybe it's an indicia of how they imagine themselves, or at least that's how I'm exploring it. So like this is Kenya, obviously, but like if you go to Rwanda, they have a similar doll, but it's different, right? Like the mouth isn't like that, the eyes aren't like that, the hair isn't like that. So I find myself usually buying those dolls just to kind of see, you know, how Kenyans imagine like a black doll should be like, and how Rwandans do that, and how South Africans do that, and stuff like that. So at this point, I was playing with these dolls, but then drawing from Kittner's women, and drawing from also like Afro-Portuguese spaces to create this. It's like a 3-minute piece that I was showing everywhere to just kind of start conversations around what our histories are and how they're shaped, and just what the reality is. So it's a silent video, which when I showed it in Accra, someone asked me about why I chose for it to be silent as opposed to like having some kind of audio added to it, especially in the space where black women are already silenced as it is. And for me, it was like I didn't want to impose my voice on the footage, because it's almost theoretical nostalgia. It's almost me like reaching out and being like, this is what I want to see in my history. But then at the same time, I felt like not adding anything to it just allowed you to like commune with the women. With like, because like if you look at her, like she's already saying a lot just from her stance. So I was like, I don't need to be speaking over her. She's doing a lot of communicating as it is. Yeah, and then I do a lot of, or I try and do a lot of interactive work, because I feel like that's how I like my art. I like being able to get in there and like touch something. I like being able to affected in some kind of way. And I also feel like that's a thing that as I'm going to say Kenyans because I can't say Africans, or maybe even just Nairobians, is something that we hunger for, like being able to get into a space, being able to touch something, being able to get some kind of response for your work. So this was motion triggered. I got footage together and then projected it in a space in Kampala, and it was a nightclub. So every time someone walked in, something happened, either to the footage or there was sound. So this was actually the dance floor that I projected these women into. The thing was called Ritual Realities because we're looking at the kind of like double consciousness, or the space, particularly in Kampala, but I feel like it's everywhere, where it's like you find all these posters up that are like Mchawi kutoka Tanzania, you know, like witch doctor from where, or Dr. So-and-so who does this. And there's like a struggle between like African spiritualities and like the dominant Christian ethos or whatever, you know. And so it was just kind of a way to put people in a space where you explore if there's any shame that you feel towards these like visions of Africanity that have been passed down to us as like the norm. Like this is how the people, you know, were before like the colonials came through, or this is how you were living before we came and rescued you. So it was just a space where people were exploring all kinds of dancing, all kinds of media that I wasn't by myself. This is like a lot of work, so I have to say this. We were like 8 artists who were doing this. And that's like more images from that. Library of Silence it kind of carried on from Lambe, and it was just, I gathered together. At this point, I felt like I was rescuing footage of black women from documentarists and stuff, and I was putting them together. And it was a motion-triggered installation that I showed at Accra to just like kind of prove that like black women have been existing, but also to kind of put people in a space where they had to be exposed to an imperfect history of black women, like in documentaries, in films, and in all their various forms. So it was just a bunch of like footages that I had grabbed from movies, from documentaries, from music videos. And depending, everyone got to have like their own experience of it because it was motion triggered. So it wasn't like a linear narrative. So depending on where you were or how you moved, the clips would show in that fashion. So no one really got this is where I'm starting and this is how it's going. It was just like, here's a grandmother carving a dildo. Here's like Kofi Olomide dances. Here's a woman like from a French film in the 50s. So everyone kind of just got bombarded with these clips and had to decide for themselves what it is they saw or how they saw it. So that was my first setup for it. And that kind of, that's another setup for it. Yeah, no, this happened as well. Yeah, this was one of the clips from Library of Silence. And my thing was just to kind of try and bring these women out of the silences, because I felt like no one was going to make a library for them. No one was ever going to like sit down in any meaningful or unmeaningful way and just like trace the existence of women in like literature, in film, in video. So there's that. Dark Star was really fun. It was also a motion triggered installation that I did in Jinja in Uganda. Photography, so for me it's kind of a mode of thinking more than a media. Or like more, I don't really think of myself as like the photographer. It's just kind of my way of visually thinking out loud. And sometimes I like to map things, and sometimes it's like the easiest way to kind of try and say what it is that I'm trying to say. So for this, I was actually like walking home, and at the time I was obsessed with cranes, and I was obsessed with how fast Nairobi's changing. So it's like the walk home. I think I've pretty much like said all I can say about that. This, so I was on Twitter, and Timothy Njoya, who happens to be, if you're my age, then like the father of Dr. Wanti Njoya, who's a good friend of mine. If you're like slightly older than that, I really don't need to tell you who he was. He was like huge in the protest cycles. He kind of still is, which I really enjoy. I went on Twitter, and he had announced that he's done a book on the divinity of the clitoris. And I was blown, because I'm kind of like, the politics of his existence is just something that I find really beautiful, because he's this old clergyman who like refuses to like soften, his stance on things. I think he got beaten up while he was fighting for multi-party democracy. Like, for some people, they'd be like, oh, that's enough. I did this one thing. Now I can like sit back and like chill for the rest of my life, because I've already made my mark on the country. But like, he's constantly using like the fact that he's a straight male who comes from a privileged, ethnicity to ruffle everyone's feathers. He's like, I will make you uncomfortable, and I will talk about these things that are like uncomfortable to you, and like think about them. So he uses his platform in really interesting ways. And so I took like a screenshot of this, because he was like, yeah, I've written this book. It's 600 pages. It's on the divinity of the clitoris. And like, the first one is like him like, for men like you to respect the female anatomy as made in God's image. And the second one is him replying to someone else and being like, telling me shame on you, and that I could find a better word than clitoris. You're a woman. Send me that better word if you know it. He's just kind of like, and so I just did like a short like photo series on that called Low Light, because there's things that we're not really supposed to talk about, or there's things that we're not really supposed to explore in like loud, aggressive ways, and he was doing that. So it just kind of helped me to do this, which I'm going to flip really fast through. And then Visibility is a Trap I did last year. The thing is, from Foucault, who we all have feelings about, Michel, and it was to revolutionary type love, looking at queerness in Nairobi. For me, I thought it would be very interesting to explore the kind of secondary existence of queerness, or how you can look at someone across a room and like through semiotics or whatever, be like, oh, that's a gay person, but then it's also like there's like a magic to it almost. There's a magic to finding safety in Nairobi if you're queer, and there's a magic to like reimagining yourself, and I wanted to explore that, but I also at this point felt like if we made it, like if you wrote a book about like how to find a queer person in Nairobi, like that could be a sword that's used against them. Mm-hmm. So by calling it Visibility is a Trap, it was kind of how to like actually take images, but then at the same time keep people safe, but then at the same time enjoy how, because you can't really be seen, you can be whoever you want to be. And like in being seen, then all these other issues come up that perhaps we're not like ready to deal with as the queer community. So this is ways in which I was trying to explore the psychological androgyny of a friend of mine who might be in the room at the moment. And for me, I really like taking photos of like the black female nude in ways that do not take away from the person. I like the idea of someone like standing strong in front of a camera, because there's ways, and I think Professor Sujali has done quite a bit of work on how women are photographed and the kind of poses they're expected to have and the kind of ways in which their power is taken from them, you know, in that photographic sphere. And so I always try and subvert that. I always try and have a woman stand in her power, or if it's a queer person or a neutral person, like whoever it is, stand in their power in front of the camera, so that even if you're looking at them, or even if they're looking away, it's like you can see there, it's still not like a capitulation of sorts. Like they still know what's going on around their environment, and they're still present, you know, no matter what they're doing. So that's that. Yeah, this is Nadia and Jamie. For me, this was kind of trying to explore the ways in which there's a lot of politics in the queer community. There's a lot of stuff around how gay men stealing from black women, or like just the fights that happen there, but then at the end of the day you still have to like stand for each other because you're all that you have. And so it's like complex, but you have to both be powerful people. You have to take care of each other, and you have to have difficult conversations, but you're kind of, it's still like you against the world, you know, especially when it comes to matters of safety and all of that. Wow, there's more. Okay, yeah, so I'll just like mention this briefly. In 2014, I was in Mombasa. I had a conversation with this guy outside of Fort Jesus, because at this point I was in my naivety finally finding out that like Fort Jesus was a slave port. And I asked him why, because he took me on a tour of the place, and I was taking all these photos, and then he was like, yeah, you know, and then the Ottoman Turks, and then like this and this, and there was no mention of slavery. And I asked him, and he was just like, listen, we sell our history so we may eat. Like, if I start telling you like this dark things, you know, you might be sad and like not tip me well. So I'm just gonna tell you the version that like, you know, you'll be like, hey, I learned something, have money, you know, and leave. And so I kind of ended up taking a few photos of that. This kind of connects to something that I did in Accra, because in coastal towns that have slave ports, I've found maybe in 3 coastal towns that have slave ports, because I then went on to kind of go into that. There's always some kind of myth around the slaves who drowned, or like a way of dealing with the trauma that doesn't exactly like say, okay, there was slavery and then this happened and now this is how we deal with it. So like when I was in Accra, and I went there because I thought they would have like a better formed way of dealing with the history that the city had come up through slavery. They said that the fishermen didn't go out on Tuesdays because that's when all the bad spirits like came back, you know. All the slaves who drowned and everything would come back on Tuesdays. So on Tuesdays there was no fishing. In Mombasa there's all these stories about jinns and stuff, that's about like the bad spirits who are still angry about the slave trade. It's the same thing in, I think it was Dar. So there's always some kind of like deep mythological story that's told, that if you dig into it is about like dealing with the trauma of the slave trade or honoring the slaves in some way. But as far as I've seen, there's like no, I mean, the question is like, how do you even honor something that was like that tragic? How do you honor those people? So I took this photo of a cat, because the cats in Mombasa, like they'll tell you like, oh, if you cross a cat wrong, like it might come to you at night and fuck you up. So I thought that was an interesting way of being like, the spirits of the people are still here, and there's ways in which we're like we tiptoe around them. Yeah, I think I'm done. I'm done. Yeah. So what are you supposed to do? Are there any questions, or
So yeah, I suppose this is where we're supposed to have a conversation. No, I was like thinking there just when you were talking about how the guide was saying that, you know, we tell our histories so that we can eat, kind of thing. It's just interesting because obviously from this side of the world, and this is where people were taken from slavery, and then I come from a place where people profited very much from it, and where a similar sort of thing happens where in Scotland, where people just don't talk about it. And we've only recently got to a point where there's going to be a slavery museum in Glasgow. We're going to start actually having the difficult conversations and to confront the history. Because I grew up in Glasgow, and Glasgow was basically built from slavery. And when you're walking around the city, if you know what it is that you're looking at, if you know what the buildings are, it's just a horrible feeling of an understanding of where all of this beautiful architecture that everyone talks about is actually coming from. So yeah, I think like there's a lot of parallels between our practices, obviously, and that's why we've been brought together to work. And the whole thing of you saying like, I'm not a photographer, I don't think I'm a photographer either. This is why I don't work in photography first. I feel like it's there, and the imagery that comes up for me to make my photographs come quite like distinctly. They come out of nowhere, they just come to me. So like the process isn't like a long thing. The thinking that happens before it is different. Like, you know, I'm either braiding across a room, or I'm drawing, or I'm just I'm just taking everything in. And then one day it's there, and then it feels like it came out of nowhere, but obviously there's been a lot of preparation. So I
think for me, like, writing is a thing that I do first. So even if I think of something, like, I'm not scared to write a photograph down before I make it. I just like to put it down in words so I can have a conversation with it about what it is that I'm trying to do. And I've found that, like, doing that makes it easier than for me to communicate it to someone else, because I don't often appear in my work. I try not to, because I don't like existing. But so I'm always like co-opting other people into my projects, and I find that if I've written it down exactly how I want it, then it becomes easier to talk to someone about what it is that I want them to do, or I just become more open to sharing the process. So, like, with Visibility is a Trap, it was very easy for me because, like, here's Nadia. Like, Nadia is a friend of mine, so we've had conversations and we had a comfort level. We trusted each other, and I trusted that she knew what she was doing, and she trusted that I knew what I was doing. The same thing with Jamie, where he had to trust that we both had to trust each other. And so I find, like, once I've written something down, I could either, like, commit to it, open it up to another person to come in and interpret it their own way, or just, like, crumple it up and throw it out, which happens quite a few times. So I'm like, this is what I want to explore, and then it's just like, that's not what the project is about. And you're like, oh, okay, great, and then just, like, let the project happen.
Yeah, that's interesting, like, because obviously, like, it would seem that I work kind of almost in the opposite way, because I'm always using my own body in my work, but my initial reasons for using myself in my work were actually to do with the fact that I felt very isolated in Scotland. So, like, I didn't really know any other black women, and I didn't feel confident enough, like, you know, you're saying you have this relationship with Nadia. I didn't feel confident enough to be like, can I get you into a dark room and paint your entire body and then take some photographs of you naked? And it's just, I mean, I think it's something that I'm working towards, like, being able to, like, actually have to build those relationships with other black women already is something that has taken time for me to be able to do, just because of the way that I've been isolated.
Yeah.
And then now, like, I feel like it's imperative that I start writing down what my projects are, not just for myself or to, like, for records, but also so that I can translate it to someone else if I'm going to ask them to actually be involved. But honestly, it's been easy enough for me to just be like, I'm just going to do this, and like, I don't feel like they're self-portraits at all. I feel like they're kind of like like I'm using my body to represent something else that's got nothing to do with my body. And so I kind of feel as if that's where it is. And I also felt quite genderless in my work for years, and, like, now I'm realizing I suppose I have to talk about, like, womanhood as well. So so it's an interesting space to be in, but hopefully as we, like, work together on Body of Land, we'll start to be able to, like, bring together our ways of working, or
And what, not to put you on the spot, even though I am putting you on the spot, but, like, how do you envision Body of Land so far? Like,
sometimes I have an image in my head and I can't describe it to someone, if you get what I mean.
Yeah.
I have ideas, and then I think that what was really interesting is that when you showed the work that you were doing with, like, the more interactive elements and having an immersive environment, that's something that I'm seeing in my head. That's something that I'm visualizing. So I'm already, like, when I went to street level, like, for GI, I was, like, looking at the space and being like, okay, how can we turn this, like, white space into something completely different? There was an amazing show that Wangechi Mutu did in the Guggenheim a couple of years ago. I can't remember, 2010 or something. And she was given this, like, white space in the Guggenheim, and she was like, okay, let's completely change this. And she came in with a hammer She just hammered the walls, and she made this this piece before she even started putting her work in called Wounded Walls, where it was like the walls were completely hammered in, and then she just like filled them to make them look like they were wounded and like kind of bloody and sort of porous, and then I'm assuming that must have been like so funny, like for the Guggenheims have to be like, so we have to replaster all of our
everything. Yeah,
I don't expect us to do that at street level, but I want to change the space in some way, and I want to be able to kind of like, so that's like the initial idea in my head.
Yeah.
I think bodies have to be in there because it's called Body Plan. But I'm just interested to see like where it goes, because right now I'm trying my best not to force anything.
Yeah.
I'm trying my best just to let things happen. So.
Cool. Any questions for Sakai in particular?
Not for you.
Actually, I do have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Maybe for both of you. I have a very specific question for you, Sakai. Oh, do you want me to speak into that? I like the way in which I want to talk about Mashave a little bit. I mean, I like the way you talked about this.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me you talked about it in two kind of connected ways. One is like the Mashave as a kind of failed ancestor. Now, you know, I've worked in Zimbabwe a lot. You come from Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe ancestors are a very particular thing in Zimbabwe, especially in Shona culture. And I've done a lot of work with spirit mediums and ancestors. So I'm kind of in that debate. So, yeah, Mashave as kind of failed ancestors that haven't been properly turned into ancestors. So in a sense, they're a bit like the unresolved past that comes back, which is the link, of course, to your work, especially the Mombasa stuff. Yeah. And then you also talk about the Mashave as this kind of trickster. Yeah. You know, and so your images really show that. And of course, there's a link between the two, because the unresolved past kind of comes back and interrupts the present and fucks everything up, you know. But it made me think, because Mashave in Zimbabwe, certainly in Mashingo, where I've lived for a long time, Mashave can also be animal spirits.
Okay.
And Mashave are also known for being incredibly powerful. And people who become incredible healers are often said to gain their powers from Mashave. But also people who are nefarious or evil. You know, they also, you know, there's a matter of profound ambivalence about whether this is power for good or power for bad. But I guess my point here is that all of this points not just to an unresolved past, but it also points to a potentiality for the future.
Right.
And I guess the point here is that a useful way of helping us to rethink how we conventionally organize time? Like, there is a problem, you mentioned the idea of trauma. There is a problem with Freud's notion of trauma. This idea of a past that doesn't want to go away, and it comes back, and you can't move forward until you deal with this past. Right. Because it is ultimately about restoring a kind of linearity to time. The past has to stay in the past for us to move forward. But I'm wondering whether Mashave as a concept, and maybe this applies elsewhere, helps us to think about time more as, and the relationship between present, past and future in a different way that's more about potentiality and possibility rather than, say, about unresolved trauma. Right. So that's my kind of first big question. And maybe I'll let you answer that and then I'll...
I'm feeling that for me, the way that it came to me, the way that that kind of concept came into my kind of view was because I was trying to deal with unresolved traumas by obviously having constant nightmares. I was trying to like figure out how do I fix this. I was trying to fix the issue, and so this is like, you know, I did a lot of lucid dreaming work, and I learned how to stop myself from having nightmares. I learned how to push that kind of or even just to be able to wake myself up was like the most important thing. So I feel as if that's where it came from, and that's obviously then links directly to what you mean about, like, you know, allowing the past to come in and, like, you know, kind of shake things up a little bit. In terms of like potentiality for the future, another element of the Mashave work for me was in relation to the way that African art is seen in the West, and the way that I felt I was being kind of pigeonholed into like having conversations about race in my work. So, like I said, the books that were on the table were texts that like were not being read by anyone else. I had them for years out of that library in the art school, and they were showing that there is a contemporary African art world that exists and that is extremely vibrant and has so much potential, and is dealing with ideas from the past and bringing them into a completely new and vibrant future. So I felt like I was, in some ways, I was kind of stating that right now in the present, this is where I'm at. I'm trying to understand this so that I can be part of it, so that I can maneuver my artwork into a space where I'm no longer trying to challenge other people's misconceptions, into a space where I'm actually like pushing past that and doing whatever the hell it is I want to do with it. So I don't know if that answered the question, but that's just where my view is on the Moshavi work for me.
It doesn't really answer the question, but I guess I didn't really give you a question, I just gave you a comment. But it does link to the other thing that I wanted to raise, if people don't mind me hogging the mic for a bit longer, which is this comment, again, that you made early on about, and you've mentioned it again just now, about, first I did this work with this white model, and it was about sleep, and everyone could see it was about sleep. And when I did it with my own body, it being a black body, no one could understand it was sleep, because as soon as there's a black body there, it has to be about race, it has to be about blackness, it has to and obviously that's a problem. And I can see that, and in Glasgow that must have been very difficult to deal with. Edinburgh, I imagine, is even more difficult, but it made me think about something that struck me when I first came to Nairobi and started hanging out with artists, which is a different question, but I think it relates to the same issue, which is I've met so many Nairobian artists who really are uncomfortable with the label African artist. Because that, in a sense, also pigeonholes them. And so really, the kind of sense I got talking to people, especially in the last few years, is, we just want to be artists. Why do we have to be African artists? And of course and I guess the question I then have is related to this. If you're doing art in Glasgow, if you're doing art in Nairobi, and some of it might be about blackness or about Africanness, are they received differently? Is it the same question? Is it a different problem? Those are some of the kind of
I think we're going to find out.
Right.
Because the work's going to be shown here and in Glasgow. We're going to find out how that's going to be seen very soon in January when the work is shown. For me it's obviously going to be different, because for myself as a black woman who's working in photography, all I had was Maud Salter as like the other black women who'd done this and who'd been given some sort of, or who'd been given space to do so, even though she was quite she was quite a force to be reckoned with as an artist as well. So I sort of see it like in order to be given space in Scotland to do this work, there already had to have been African artists doing something interesting. So it wasn't that, I don't think that any of this is coming about because people are seeing my work clearly. I think it's coming about because there is, I think the Western world is starting to very slowly catch on to what's been happening on the African continent, which is a lot of amazing work. So I think I'm sort of like the beneficiary of that, as a Scottish person or someone who lives in Scotland. I'm going to see my work at street level, which I never thought was going to happen ever, because I wasn't being given space for such a long time. And then in Nairobi, I think you can maybe answer that a little bit better, because obviously you're from here.
Actually, not just Nairobi, because you've shown your work in Kampala, in Accra, and you've been.
I think for me the interesting thing is I don't fit into what is considered an African artist. I'm not really doing the paintings. I'm not really my work is video triggered, motion triggered installations, and so I'm constantly coming across the not being African enough trope, and it comes in cute questions, it's so did you grow up in Nairobi? It's there's this kind of how long have you been in the West type things that are thrown at me because of the way in which I do the things that I do. So I'm benefiting from the same thing you're benefiting from, where like the West is like, oh, there's people, on the continent who are doing interesting things, but at the same time, it's an interesting space to then like be here, and people are like, so you paint? I'm like, I do, but that's like for me. I don't show anyone any of my paintings. And it's like, you sing? Like, what do you mean you're an artist? So it's a weird, like, transient space to exist in. But I do find it very wonderful to kind of just like impose my art on people, which I think is one of the reasons why I do immersive things, where you have to like come in and the things are reacting to your presence, and you kind of have to either respond to them or just like as long as you're there, I feel like I've done my work. And it's fascinating for me that it's easier for me to show my work in Accra or in Josie or in different parts of the continent than it is here, or that even when I'm talking about like showing my work here, then it's a question of like, oh, do we have the equipment to be able to do this for you? Because basically, one, how do we monetize, a motion-triggered installation? Or how do we explain this to people? Because it's already hard enough getting into a gallery space for a lot of Kenyans, for reasons I kind of understand, but also choose to not understand. There's questions of accessibility, and then there's questions of trying to convince people that photography is art, and paintings are like cool and you should see them, or like you should talk to artists. There's already those, like, that level of questions. So to then bring in here's like a motion triggered installation thing just feels like to throw people so far away, or at least that's how it's been explained to me a number of times.
You. Hey.
Hello. I have a question about ghosts. How do you invoke the spirits that appear in your work, or do they choose you? Do you find that Makeda spoke to you from Ethiopia, or do you feel like when you were studying, when you were trying to like write a draft of your dissertation, that she appeared? Like, do you choose, or do they?
Okay, so yeah, I did invoke one. So I have this other body of work that I didn't show, which I wish I had now, called Invocation, and it was invoking the goddess Kali. And I asked her. I was gonna go to sleep one night, and I had this very clear idea of what I wanted, and I just said, "Please, can I use your image?" And I felt like it was important to ask her, because if I didn't ask her, things could happen. So that was the one time that I felt like I needed to actually ask, and I felt like it was important to do so, especially because Kali doesn't come from my own culture. And I didn't want to appropriate. I wanted to sort of like take her image and sort of express something that was it's very similar, because in the terms of the way that she's been misinterpreted by the West as like just complete evil and chaos, I felt that's how black women like are seen as well, as angry, chaotic beings who, we never know what they're going to do next, kind of thing. So I felt like, we were having a similar experience of the way that we were being seen. So I felt like, if she could give me access to her image for that. So that was one time I did do that. With Mshavi, I feel like the Shavi is me, like, actually, but it's also, it has elements of my personality embedded in it. So, like I was saying, like the other day at Kona in my talk, that colour is really important to me. So the colours that are in the Shavi are actually the colours that I use in certain ways when I, for example, if I want to feel confident, I wear red. If I want to feel calm, I wear blue. So she's basically got red, blue and purple in the body paint. So I just felt like that was kind of like, I wanted it to be clear that it's me, but it's also an aspect of something else. So.
I have dreams. I have like really specific, sometimes scary dreams, and we're talking about it the other day because I think we both suffer from sleep paralysis in some ways. And for me, it's like there's dreams, and that like really helps me, or at least like launches my curiosity in a particular direction. And then there's like all the research that has been done like before I was born, or that is inaccessible in some way. I really like that people write things. I really like that I can hack into areas that I'm not being granted access into and like get something. I also really like online libraries. Let's face it, I don't like leaving the house, but thank God for the internet. So for me, like something would happen. Like I remember early last year, my uncle died, and we went to bury him, and all these rituals that were being done that I was a tourist to, really. Like I didn't know, and I couldn't contextualize what was happening. And through that, there was just like energies, you know, there was like this palpable connection to things that I couldn't understand. And I went online and found all these Luo scholars who had written in some form to kind of archive things, right? So right now I'm reading about like the Luo understanding of the soul and how the soul works and how it's split into three, and you know, like what this part does and what this part does, and like the ambivalent one that's like, if you treated me right, then I'm good, I'm now an ancestor. If you treated me wrong, I'm fucking you guys up for the next 50 years, you know. So it's like I'm not going to have the chance to like sit down with my grandfather, or to like be in a space where this is normal, right? So all I have is like my sister being like, oh yeah, so and so's mom has like a spirit that takes over her when she's angry, and like a ritual has to be performed for her to calm down, and then like being like, oh, what's that, and then launching into that. So my stuff is like, it's really based on being Luo, but it's also like me digging into the things that I feel like I've missed out on, because, you know, I was born in the city and this is where I've grown up and stuff like that. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question if there's no other question. So since both of you have these invocations in your work, and you're both based so far away, and the title of your collaboration is Body of Land, are there opportunities that you have to invoke or to set up a ritual together to see who you would call on, and to have whatever happens in the physical space be informed by whatever spirit wants to meet you collectively? Is that a possibility?
I think that's a really interesting possibility, and we might steal that idea from you. Yeah.
Same. Same.
Say to me.
My name is Kevin Odur.
Hi.
Hi.
I know you.
I'm good. I don't know whether to start from home first with a war. And these are just sentiments that,
It's sentiments, it's not questions.
or rather insights. First, I'm a Luo. And I was lucky to be born in the city, but also part of my life was in the village. And when it comes to matters of spiritual, when it comes to matters of culture, I was lucky enough at that time. I was a bit young, and my secondary school education for 4 years was in the village. And I used to ask a lot of questions for people who I used to find around, and things used to happen around me, just what a war is saying. People are doing things that you don't understand, and there's all that kind of things. Now, generally, a war, the way you're working with Nadia, I feel as an artist, trying to express yourself through another person, I think that is the most difficult thing, and I really appreciate that Nadia understands what you are trying to express. For me, that is a mileage. When it comes to traditions, there's what you called it Lambe. I have to translate it again into Luo, which is Limbe. And Limbe in Luo is visits. And visits, it can be in terms of spirits. When you are sleeping, you are visited by your ancestors. And this I used to hear a lot in the village. So each time you kept on pronouncing Lambe, I was, okay, this is Limbe. And you are talking about the culture, and you are talking about spirits. And this is what was all the time coming back to my mind, that you should also know that Limbe are visits. And these visits can be from ancestors, and they are spiritual. So that kept on coming, and I felt that it's important that I express that part. Culturally, I can see you are dwelling in the past, the history, and actually the Luo culture deals a lot with history, and they don't always like to forget about the ancestors, and I really appreciate that part. Though it's very deep, and it can also be very complicated, and you cannot separate art from spirit when it comes to expression. And then now I go to Sekai. She's our good visitor back in the studio. She talks a lot also about culture, and which I also feel is much more connected because it's African culture. And when you talk about dreams, I also go back to the spirits, and it also connects me also to the village. And that is why I feel that both of you working together, for me, it's a good combination. And I'm just making that comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions?
Hi. I have a general question, and it's weird. In the dream state, and it's very specific, when you're dreaming about those things, the sentiment, or do you feel, is it textural? Can you feel like textures? Can you smell things? Like, is it textural in that aspect where, like, you know what you felt and you can probably feel it a year away from now and like be like, what the you know what I'm saying? Okay, that's all I wanted to hear, and hear a little bit more about that.
I think the difference for me is between like a dream where I'm kind of like just haphazardly moving through different worlds and different things, and I'm not really very conscious of it, and a lucid dream where I am aware of what's happening, and it's usually like in that sort of early hours of the morning just before I wake up, sort of like coming out of REM sleep. That's when things become a bit more textural, because I feel like I'm part of my kind of conscious mind is starting to wake up to the fact that I'm dreaming, and that's where I kind of can feel things and I can sense things. And then another element as well is sleep paralysis, which obviously in itself, like, you're now awake, like, in some way, in body or in mind, and so things that happen to you in that state they seem more vivid, more real, and more tangible. And then another element again is night terror. Now, night terror is like a whole other thing. Like, it's terrifying, but it will jolt you for, like, you know, in many ways, like, it's kind of a precursor to something really, like, before I make something quite good, if I make a piece of work that's quite good, I've probably had a pretty bad night terror before, because that's where the real visceral bodily reactions come from.
That's an interesting muse to have. I think for me it's like more sleep paralysis, where I'm in my bed and I'm awake, but stuff is happening and I'm not sure if it's happening in my head or, you know, if there's actually a person there trying to do that. And it's also, I think, just like good old-fashioned nightmares. And I've had nightmares where, like, you know, 6 months later I'll be in a place and I'll smell something that I smelled in a nightmare, and I'll just be like, get the fuck out, you know. Like, I don't play curiosity games with, like, those kind of switches where it's like, oh, that smells familiar. Already my mind is just like, we remember this, like, let's not. So they do tend to be quite visceral. And I remember there were times when I was in Birmingham and I would wake up with wounds that I got in my dreams. So yeah, there's like stuff that happens in those o'clocks that you're never quite sure if, like, this is a dream state or if like this is real life. And I think that's, as I said, an interesting muse to have.
I forgot about auditory stuff. Like, in the sort of sleep paralysis state, you get a lot of auditory hallucinations that, like, sometimes they're just really arbitrary things, like someone walking around. You just hear, like, footsteps, but they're not scary, because it's just like as if someone's just wandering around the house. They might, like, be pottering around in the kitchen. You wake up, there's no one there. So then you're just like, you know, that's it's a really interesting thing, though, how you know, that hypnagogic state, so many things, like your senses are being, like, woken up and stimulated in some way, and I don't really know what exactly is doing it, like, or whether it's just because you're still dreaming in some capacity. Yeah. Any more?
Okay, I've been told that we have to finish now. Okay. But before we do that, let me first of all say thank you so much, because I thought that was really interesting and a real pleasure for Thursday afternoon. So thank you very much. And how long are you here for still?
I've got another 3 weeks here. I've got 2 weeks left of my this is my second week. I've got 1 week left of my residency, and then I have an extra week in Nairobi, and I actually wish I'd stayed longer now. Okay. Yeah, quite.
And then is there going to be a showing for this body of land here, or?
Yeah. So this is the bit I'm not 100% sure. Like, it's going to be in Nairobi anyway. I'm not 100% sure where. But then it'll be in January 2019. And it'll be shown simultaneously in Glasgow. Okay. Whatever it is we're doing. So.
Well, please let us know. And we'll let
we will.
Our followers know. There's tea and stuff outside, but I also remind people that on Monday we have a conversation about the exhibition See Around Us with Annie, who's sitting next to me, which is about Palestine, and then we're showing a film, and I've forgotten what the film was called. Can we put our hands together, because that was great.
Thank you.